chairman of the occasion, another protocol duly observed. It's a privilege for me to have to read this citation of Professor Tunde Adeleke. Professor Tunde Adeleke, Director of African American Studies in the College of Liberal Arts and Science at Iowa State University, spent his first 11 years as an academic at the University of Ife, now Femi Mimiko University, Ile-Ife, and the University of Maiduguri, now in Borno State. Born in Kaduna of a Yoruba father and a Hausa mother, he had his NYSC in Imo State. Professor Adeleke is married to an Igbo lady, and this, of course, no doubt, makes him a good, best Nigerian. Indeed, you can agree with me that he is qualified to be the next president of this country. According to him, I quote, "I grew up in a city, but my development was pretty much defined by that compound of people with backgrounds of common ancestry. In that classed world, I actually attained my social consciousness." End of quote. Also a product of the University of Ife and professor of history, our keynote speaker of today, Professor Adeleke, brings his African perspective to the African and African American studies position. He is able to illustrate issues drawn from his background that help students have a better understanding of African American history. According to him, there is so much of that is Black Americans' history tied to Africa that you can only understand if you also understand African history. Students appreciate learning from that context, and there is no way you can get that in a textbook. End of quote. African American Studies, his specialized area is a cross-disciplinary program in the College of Liberal Arts and Science. His contribution and the new identity he gave the discipline in his university and the United States cannot be overqualified. Students explore the history and experiences of blacks in America. Africans in America, Africans and black and people of African descent throughout the world. He single-handedly changed the program's title from African American Studies to reflect an expanding curriculum that includes stronger links to Africa. His argument is that, according to him, I quote, "In the late 60s, he said, the focus was on the Black American experience. What happens to blacks in America? 40 years later, the program has grown, and we can enrich the field by broadening it. The black experience didn't start in America, it started in Africa." End of quote. The name change will not, as he explains, detract from the program's traditional emphasis on Black America. It's a win-win situation, according to Professor Adeleke, because the change will help us to better understand the Black American experience. Professor Adeleke's journey to Iowa State University in 1978 began in 1978 when he finished his undergraduate degree at the University of Ife, and he was interested in graduate study in African history. At the time, Africa was seeing an offspring of nationalism regarding the experience of blacks in the diaspora. The African diaspora was the first dispensation of peoples to other parts of the world, most notably the slave trade to the Americans. He was told if he wanted to study African history, he ought to also examine the diaspora to understand the complete story. That led Professor Tunde Adeleke to the University of Western Ontario, Canada, where he received his PhD. He knew the United States was the place to study the diaspora, but he made an unreasonable roadblock there because he was required to take a test of English as a foreign language. That was offensive to him because he was coming from a country that had English as a national language, that is Nigeria. So he didn't see the reason, he didn't see any reason for him to be asked to do a test in English again when he was sure that he was qualified already. According to him, I had the qualifications and I believed it was unreasonable. Therefore, he had to take a journey to Canada to actualize his dream. Professor Adeleke began studying with a professor whose expertise was slavery, and he later received funds for summer research in the United States. After earning his doctoral degree, Adeleke taught for 5 years in Nigeria before returning to the United States for history and African American Studies faculty position at Ohio State and Loyola of New Orleans. In 2000, he was named Director of African American Studies at the University of Montana, Isola. Entering his third year at Ohio State, Professor Adeleke sees additional growth in his program, which is adding 2 new faculty members. Similarly, programs at other US universities also are expanding. According to him, I quote, "There is a strong interest in the African American experience and in broadening it and linking it with the broader global Black experience." Professor Adeleke has been a professor of history and director of African American Studies at the University of Montana, Isola, since 2000. He has also taught history and African American Studies at Loyola University, New Orleans, Tulane University, North Carolina University, and Ohio State University. While at Montana, Professor Adeleke has initiated and implemented the African American Studies minor and the program's outreach efforts. He is the author of several books, including In the Course of Humanity, Martin Arrow Delaney's Civil War and Reconstruction Reader. Professor Tunde Adeleke is Professor of History and Director of the African American Studies Program at the University of Montana. He earned his PhD from the University of Western Ontario. He has presented papers at numerous conferences and is the author of Songe, the Heritage Library of African Peoples. He is also the author of On African Americans, 19th Century Black Nationalists and the Civilizing Mission. He is the author of Without Regard to Race, the other Martin Arrow Delaney. Professor Adeleke is the editor of Booker T. Washington, Interpretive Essays. He has also edited Critical Perspectives on historical and contemporary issues about Africa and African America. On African Americans, 19th Century Black Nationalists and the Civilizing Mission by Adeleke emphasizes the central contention, the central contention of Tunde Adeleke's on African American. I'm sorry, I take that again. The central contention of Tunde Adeleke's on African American is that prominent 19th century Black leaders pursued a nationalism ostensibly in opposition to European nationalism, but that was in fact modeled after it. No doubt, I can assure you all today that we are about to have additional dose of his poetics as he delivers his keynote address. So So please, would you join me to welcome Professor.
My presentation, Africa and Afrocentric Historicism, Equity. Appropriately, because I deem it important that a conference that honors one of Africa's leading intellectuals and one that deals directly with the intersecting issues of Africa and the diaspora, someone whose scholarship actually, encompasses both fields, that it's important that I, as a historian of the African and African-American experience, to examine what I consider to be a fundamental flaw in how a segment of the diaspora intelligentsia engage African history, and hence the topic, Africa and Afrocentric Historicism. The Black experience in America, and indeed the Black experience worldwide, has borne what I call the burden of Western history, the history of negation. The Dark Continent, heathens, barbarians are some of the racist epithets that enlightened Europe mobilized to launch what became known as the white man's border. This worldview denied peoples of African ancestry a credible space among civilized beings. It nullified African history and culture and mandated Europeans to lead Africans and diaspora blacks towards civilization, historical and cultural rebirth. The obliteration or the attempt to obliterate African history and culture, which justified enslavement and white superiority, popularized what Samuel Dubai Cook characterized as a tragic historical consciousness. Paradoxically, an ideology meant to nurture a compliant, subordinate, and docile personality induced in blacks as well a self-deterministic resolve to resist using the weapon of history. Europeans had used history to legitimize black subordination. As several black intellectuals have demonstrated, from the late El Top through John Ernest to the more recent work by Stephen Hall, the negation of African history and culture induced in blacks a determination to resist with the weapon of history. Put differently, the denigration of African history ignited a passion for historical studies. As Malcolm X once declared, quote, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research," unquote. This interest in history, in African history, birthed the nucleus of a black intelligentsia in the 19th century. These pioneers in protest, as El Top described them, James Pennington, William Wells Brown, Benjamin Brawley, William Copperniel, and many others, embarked on the study and research of history in order to combat that racism that permeated the intellectual culture of their times. Long before the appearance of a professional class of black intellectuals, the challenge of historical racism compelled some black leaders to seek historical knowledge. G.N. Grisham, a professor and principal of a high school in Kansas City, Missouri, who was once described as, quote, "one of the ablest educators and most practical philosophers in this country," unquote, delivered a speech in December of 1897 in which he emphasized the importance of historical scholarship, and he urged black scholars to, quote, "do something for his race," unquote, by helping to develop a revolutionary historical consciousness and forging, quote, "the connection between this race and civilization," unquote. Grisham wanted black intellectuals to reclaim that link between Africa and civilization that leading historians, leading European intellectuals had denied. His motivations and visions were consistent with those of the early pioneers. He will be left to future generations to theorize about black intellectual responsibility. William E.B. Du Bois suggested, the intellectual leadership that he characterized as the talented tent will have to engage historical studies in order to deconstruct centuries of what Carnegie Woodson will later describe as Eurocentric miseducation. The preoccupation of black intellectuals with revising and publicizing black history and culture became a critical repertoire of resistance. Due to the historical circumstances, the writings of the pioneers were driven more by advocacy and rehabilitation than respect for canons of historical scholarship. Most of them were activists who were drawn to history by the challenges of debunking entrenched historical fallacies. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, W.E.B. Du Bois and Woodson had inaugurated a school of professional historians who combined advocacy with attention to the cardinal rule of historical scholarship: research derived from credible and verifiable historical source. To be taken seriously, therefore, black intellectuals must not be driven solely by ideology and advocacy. They had to be validated by established canons of historical scholarship. Du Bois, Woodson, and members of what became known as the New Negro History Movement utilized their research and scholarship to gain legitimacy for black history. Black history became the foundation on which black studies, developed in the late 1960s. No one better understood the importance of intellectual credibility than the late John Hope Franklin, whose scholarship remains a lasting monument of intellectual credibility. As he observed, quote, "The dilemma and problem of the Negro scholars are numerous and complex. He, that is the Negro scholar, has been forced, first of all, to establish his claim to being a scholar. And he had somehow to seek recognition in the general world of scholarship," unquote. Furthermore, Franklin continued, quote, "Since American scholarship in general denied that Negroes were capable of being scholars, the black scholar had to first struggle against forces and personalities in American life that insisted that he could never rise in the intellectual space," unquote. Earlier generations have struggled against these forces and personalities and won recognition for black history, which set the stage for black studies. The institutionalization of black studies had the unintended consequence of ghettoizing of the black intellectual. Black intellectuals became, according to Franklin, the victims of segregation in the field of scholarship, unquote. Paradoxically, the struggle to validate African historical tradition led to the depiction of the black intellectual as someone uniquely qualified and best suited to study and research black history and experience. As Franklin suggested, blacks were deemed to possess, quote, "peculiar talents that fitted them to study themselves and their problems," unquote. He called on black scholars to reject this unfortunate development, this ghettoizing, to resist combating Eurocentrism with its black equivalent. He said they should reject this ghettoizing, but at the same time, in fighting the ghettoizing, they should resist, fighting Eurocentrism with its black equivalent. In other words, stay clear of racist historiography. He acknowledged, however, that, quote, "the task of remaining calm and objective is indeed a formidable one for black historians, and that the black intellectual is always tempted to, quote, pollute his scholarship with polemics, diatribes, and argument." Although Franklin understood the problematic of objectivity in the context of such overwhelmingly intellectual bigotry, he warned the black scholar, the black intellectual, nonetheless, against succumbing to the temptation, the attractive temptation to fight intellectual racism with intellectual racism. This will only destroy, according to him, your effectiveness as a scholar and disqualify the black scholar as a true and worthy scholar. Franklin urged black intellectuals to recognize the difference between scholarship and advocacy, and to use scholarship to correct the findings of pseudo-scholars in other disciplines who had used their writings to oppress Africa. Although he acknowledged that there is a place for advocacy in scholarship, Franklin, advocated developing a clear understanding of the distinction between advocacy and scholarship. There is need for advocacy, but you must also make a distinction between that and real scholarship. No school of black intellectuals has either failed or refused to distinguish between advocacy and scholarship, and blatantly flout every recognized and established canons of historical scholarship more than Afrocentrism. Building upon the historical tradition of black alienation, Afrocentric scholars advocate jettisoning objectivity and scholarship and prioritizing ideology and advocacy instead. While Franklin called for recognizing the importance of the use of objective data in the passionate advocacy of the rectification of injustice, Afrocentric scholars boldly dismiss objectivity and questions its values in historical scholarship. Building on the 19th century Afrocentric ideas of Martin Delaney, Henry Garnet, and many others, Afrocentric scholars like Molefi Ashanti, Molani Karenga, Naim Akbar, Donna Marimba, the late John Henry Clark, Chancellor Williams, and so on, developed Afrocentric history into a full-fledged and competitive ideology of intellectual resistance. It is imperative to contextualize Afrocentric historicism within the tradition of black resistance. Several 19th century intellectuals published to rescue black history from obscurity and used evidence of African history and African cultural wealth to both affirm their humanity and citizenship and to gain recognition for Africa and diaspora blacks as contributors to world history and civilization. Their writings bore the seeds of a future Afrocentric genre. W.E.B. Du Bois' theory of the talented tenth underscored the critical role of the intellectual. As he emphasized it, the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. Thus, from the 19th century pioneers in protest, through Jean M. Grisham, to W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, the imperative for a black intellectual leadership and counter-hegemonic protest historiography had been unambiguously affirmed. However, cognizant of the critical need for black intellectual leadership, Grisham was equally mindful of a challenge that John Hope Franklin would later underscore: the need for the black intellectual, for the black scholar to appeal beyond race. According to Grisham, the Negro scholar must not confine himself to Negro questions. He must, in action, manifest the breadth of Terence, mankind, humanity. To generate this kind of scholarship, black intellectuals turn their searchlight on Africa. The use of African history as a counter-hegemonic discipline gained momentum in the early 20th century. Two individuals helped advance this development: Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson. Harvard-trained historians, Du Bois and Woodson researched and published extensively to establish African history as a serious field of intellectual discourse. They published the work of African history and civilization and contributions of Africans and diaspora black civilization. They affirmed both the historical agency of Africans and diaspora blacks and established black history as a serious intellectual discipline. Future generations such as John O. Franklin, Benjamin Cobb expanded this tradition and prepared the ground for the civil rights movement. Franklin's own landmark study, From Slavery to Freedom, now in its 9th edition, reflected the progressive and interventionist essence of this historiography, one defined by faith in the profitability of America. This progressive genre, which was dominant in the 1940s and 50s, soon came under scrutiny as those who were disillusioned with the slow progress of change began to demand for a more combative historiography. Critics demanded for an instrumentalist and adversarial historiography that challenged America for failure to adhere to its democratic ideals. Addressing advocates such as Vincent Harding, Stanley Stockey, favored abandoning the progressive and integrationist tradition. They preferred instead a combative and anti-establishment history. Harding, for example, faulted those he called the fathers of Negro history for being overly optimistic about America, and thereby they diminished the excesses and tragedies of American history. In his own critique, Stockey accused members of the new Negro history of failure, quote, to condemn America for her crimes against black people, unquote, and for being so blinded by optimism that they ignored the tragedies of American history. Both proposed a radical and ideologically driven black history, developed specifically for advancing the black struggle. This was the precursor of Afrocentric historiography. The historicity and antiquity of civilization in Africa had been affirmed by the onset of the 60s civil rights movement. Black history had won recognition, but the struggle was far from over. The next phase was the struggle for the institutionalization of black studies and securing a critical space in American higher education for the teaching and dissemination of information about Africa and the diaspora. The establishment of black studies, however, soon illuminated a sub-layer of the intellectual context, the context for cultural and civilizational preeminence. Black studies became for some not just a field for disseminating knowledge about the black and African diaspora, but also for reenacting old battles over history, culture, and historical preeminence and civilization. The most fundamental of this battle was the battle to resolve the question of historical preeminence. Africa or Europe, which came first? Thus, there developed a strong connection between politics and pedagogy in the 1960s struggle. The conception of America as irredeemably racist bolstered demand for segregated education. And as Harun Karim and Ellen Hayes corroborate, quote, the late 1960s and early 1970s saw the resurgence in black nationalist thought in education and a push toward an Afrocentric curriculum, unquote. Afrocentric scholars took on this struggle with a crusading zeal. By the late 1970s, Afrocentrism had emerged as a full-fledged ideological and philosophical black studies paradigm. The Afrocentric perspective is premised on centering Africa as the focus of black diaspora epistemology. It developed largely in reaction to what was perceived as a critical need for a forceful ideological response to Eurocentric historiography. In Molefi Asante's view, Eurocentrism had destroyed African culture, de-Africanized the consciousness of blacks, arrested their economic and cultural development, and it remains a potent threat. Against Eurocentrism, Asante and his ideological cohort proposed Afrocentrism, which he defines as, quote, a frame of reference wherein phenomena are viewed from the perspective of the African person, which seeks in every situation the appropriate centrality of the African person, unquote. Afrocentric solution therefore entails strengthening black American knowledge and awareness of African historical and cultural heritage and making Africa the foundation of knowledge. Although, a 20th century terminology, the fundamental tenets of Afrocentrism are actually rooted in history. By the second half of the 20th century, however, Afrocentrism had become more structured and ideological. Leading scholars vigorously rejected Eurocentric constructions of knowledge and what they perceived as the universalistic pretensions of Western education. Ashanti, Karenga, John Henry Clark, and others began to publish Afrocentric history texts in defense and validation of African and black historical, black history and culture. This combative ideological character became even more pronounced in the 1980s in reaction to Ronald Reagan's counter-civil rights initiative. The more blacks felt marginalized by and alienated from the Reagan presidency, the closer they were drawn to Africa. Assuming and publishing and proclaiming African identity became a means of existential validation and a counter-hegemonic resistance to an oppressive and seemingly racist establishment. Paradoxically, Reagan's policy bolstered the utilitarian appeal of Africa as a viable, albeit symbolic, emblem of resistance to what blacks perceived as the anti-African, anti-black character of national policies. It is worth revealing, though, that it was precisely in the mid-1980s, during the Reagan presidency, that leading black Americans officially and publicly adopted African American as preferred identity. Premised on a Manichaean conception of reality, Afrocentrism offers re-Africanization as the only viable weapon of resistance, survival, and eventual triumph for diaspora black re-Africanization. As Asante puts it, quote, we are seriously in battle for the future of our culture. Afrocentric vigilance is demanded to preserve our culture, unquote. To Africans who have lived amidst Europeans or the lands of their ancestors, of the Native Americans, and who have in consequence been exploited materially, Ashanti offers strong grounding of centering in African history as a strategy for liberation. Re-establishing connection with Africa became a critical step toward empowerment for black Americans. Africa therefore offers diaspora blacks a rich history of antiquity, culture, and civilizations, the very basis of identity, and a rallying point for group and corporate initiatives against Eurocentric threat. Since the negation of African civilization and culture justified the subordination of blacks, Afrocentric scholars vigorously challenge these negative portraits and images in order to affirm, albeit philosophically and psychologically, a counter-hegemonic African identity and homeland. Reversing centuries of African and diaspora historical misrepresentation, which was, this reversal was critical to self-esteem. Convinced that blacks would never be fully integrated in America, Afrocentric historians represented black and American as contradictory and antagonistic. To be black and American were irreconcilable. They portray America as an arena of conflict between two irreconcilable worldviews, locked in a context for superiority. Afrocentric historiography therefore focuses on challenging Europe's claim to preeminence in history, civilization, morality, and culture. Afrocentric scholars seek to resolve this battle over history and civilization with a declaration of Africa's superiority. They advance what Jacob Chavez characterized as, quote, Afrocentric universal history that positions Africa at the very apex of global historical development. They then couple this history with a monolithic construction of identity for all blacks, regardless of location, thus dehistoricizing almost 4 centuries of New World acculturation. Like their 19th century predecessors, modern Afrocentric scholars reject the nullification of African history and culture. They address 2 key challenges. First, reconstructing and establishing a credible homeland and history. Second, affirming a countervailing monolithic African identity for all blacks. This identity, as the late black psychologist Amos Wilson acknowledged, is essentially and fundamentally a protest identity. According to him, to be African, spelled with a K, A-F-I-K-A-N, to be African is inherently anti-hegemonic, he said. The writings of the late Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop constitute the ideological bedrock of the Afrocentric genre. Perhaps his most notable contributions is deconstructing of the Hamitic interpretation of Egyptian history, origins, and affirmation instead of its Negroid origins and character. Now, thus, Diop reclaimed ancient Egypt for Africa, for black Africa. In his view, Africans and diaspora blacks needed ancient Egypt as to serve the same purpose that the classical Greco-Roman civilization served Europeans. According to him, for us, the return to Egypt in all fields is a necessary condition to reconcile African civilization with history, to be able to build a body of human sciences and to renew African culture. Now, agreeing with Diop, Ashanti writes, quote, Afrocentrism establishes the centrality of the ancient Kemetic Egyptian civilization and the Nile Valley cultural complex as points of reference for an African perspective in much the same way as Greece and Rome served for Europeans. But then, building on Diop's work, Ashanti portrays ancient Egyptian civilization as both the foundation of Africa's classical civilization and the progenitor of European civilization. By focusing on ancient Egypt, blacks, Amos Wilson argued, are trying to take back what European historiography had stolen from them. There were two key, very dynamic, aspects of Afrocentric historiography. First, establishing the antiquity of civilization and culture in Africa, and second, affirming the influence of Egyptian, civilization on ancient Greece, and by extension, Africa's superiority over European civilization. Substituting what somebody called Afrocentric diffusionist history for Eurocentric history, Afrocentric scholars proclaim Africa the epicenter of world civilization. Most telling, they represent ancient Egypt as the birthplace of science, of philosophy, of mathematics, the intellectual fountain of Greek scholars. This was where, according to them, Greek scholars studied before going to Western Europe to become, popular. The logic of this is very simple. What shall be described as Greek dependency theory. The logic of this is very simple. If ancient Greece is the fountain of Western culture, if ancient Egypt is the fountain of, I'll take that again. If ancient Greece is the fountain of Western culture, and if it could be proven that Greek scholars went to Egypt to study before going to become important, then it can be argued that Western civilization is a product of African civilization. That's the logic. Now, the refusal to acknowledge Egyptian influence in Greek science and philosophy compared Afrocentric scholars to invoke what they call the stolen legacy theory. According to this theory, Western civilization is a product of a stolen ancient Egyptian and African legacies. They identified the Alexandrian conquest of Egypt as the pivotal point of this theft. Greek scholars allegedly accompanied Alexander in his rampage through Egypt and pilfered the ancient, treasures and libraries of the Egyptian temples. Developing and establishing affinity with the heritage of grandeur and opulence in Africa became an obsessive preoccupation of Afrocentric historians. This entailed establishing, embellishing, and at times willfully misrepresenting African historical and cultural realities. This was also accompanied by a reluctance or refusal to acknowledge and engage historical change. In The Source of Black Folk, published in 1903, Du Bois described the Black American as peoples of dual identities who are constantly battling with and in fact tormented by the conflicting demands of this duality. This conflict and this torment notwithstanding, Du Bois warned, he cautioned against privileging any of the identities. Some critics, however, characterize the duality as an accurate and perceptive representation of the complexities of Black America. Afrocentric scholars, however, disagree. Anxious to deny any lasting European influence on Blacks, they contest the duality, proclaiming instead the permanence and immutability of the African identity. Ashanti, for example, insists he was never afflicted by double consciousness. The emphasizing the duality, he said, quote, "I was never afflicted by the Du Boisian double consciousness. I never felt two warring ideals in one body, nor did I experience a conflict over my identity. I am an African, that's all." The true Afrocentrist, therefore, according to Ashanti, retains his or her Africanness intact. As Jacob Salvate underscores, the major problem with this historiography is the attempt to split the duality of the Black American, to magnify one dimension of the identity, the African, and to deny the other, the American. Thus, such dehistoricizing enables Afrocentric scholars to construct a monolithic identity for diaspora Blacks, regardless of location, ignoring the complex, multiple, and complicated historical and cultural experiences. To enhance Black self-esteem, Afrocentric scholars advance what I call a monolithic construction of Black diaspora history and a romanticized view of the African past. They portray pre-colonial Africa as a place of harmony, advanced cultural and civilizational achievement. In his criticism of Afrocentrism, Shavitz rightly notes that Afrocentrism uses, quote, strategies of cultural reaffirmation to effect a sense of collective inferiority by boosting national self-esteem or express a sense of collective superiority, unquote. But Afrocentric ideology was not meant only for enhancing Black self-esteem. It was also targeted at white cultural arrogance. Paradoxically, despite its anti-Eurocentric and anti-hegemonic character, Afrocentrism soon developed its own hegemonic and some would argue racist tendencies. The claim of Africa's preeminence and superiority in history and civilization, one such theory was that of Leonard Jeffreys. The curious dichotomy he developed between those he called the so-called some people, Africans, superior, and the so-called ice people, Europeans, inferior. Thankfully, this embarrassing theory has crawled into obscurity. Now, as Shavit acknowledged, the quest for validation in antiquity is a driving force of Afrocentric historiography. Afrocentric scholars desperately seek to establish originality and distinctiveness in antiquity, a preoccupation that was undoubtedly driven by Eurocentric denial of African antiquity. Shavit characterized this search for authenticity and antiquity as, quote, an important tool in a vanquished nation's struggle for pride, dignity, and status. Ancient Egypt enables Afrocentric scholars to establish both the genesis and evolution of civilization in Africa and authenticity in antiquity. They research ancient Egypt in the hope of finding within it the origins of a Black-centered philosophy, a foundation for group unity and identity, a source of resistance to clear domination, and a basis for independence and creativity. Now, I'm going to go down to my concluding remark, which is that what I've drawn your attention to here is simply what I call the dehistoristic tendencies of Afrocentric historiography. The fact that, the tendency to ignore history, to say we can close our eyes to centuries, almost 200 centuries of change in the diaspora, and argue that the diaspora is still fundamentally African, regardless of those periods. But not only that, Afrocentrism also takes that beyond the American boundaries, to talk more in terms of really a global Black identity. Because Asante argues, even in its more recent work, that there is a unifying cultural, what you call cultural, paradigm that we all share. Black Americans, Blacks in diaspora, Blacks everywhere, Africans here, that has not been significantly impacted by the ocean, according to him. It's not changed at all, and in this respect, even the what is called the Africanism, the retentions of African culture among the diaspora, in combination, all makes the Africans in diaspora still fundamentally African. So they argue then for a collective identity. Even in the age of globalization, as people are talking about transnational identity, people are talking about the possibility of cultural citizenship. People are talking about the possibility that the demand of the nation state on your identity is increasingly being challenged as globalization now shrinks boundaries. Afrocentrics argue that no, globalization is just the modern euphemism for the old Eurocentrism. It is still Americanism on the global stage, and therefore the old threat remains to black culture and black survival. And given the threat of globalization, given the fact that identity, even though people argue that identity is now becoming much more flexible, identity is becoming more of a state of becoming, really. It's not inflexible now in terms of identity. It's now more, some say, the in-betweenness, the concept of in-betweenness. So it's not permanent, it's not stable, it keeps changing because of the dynamics of globalization. Afrocentrics argue that identity, as far as they are concerned, the black identity, is still very much an identity that should be defined by that history of alienation and negation. And therefore race, culture, Africa becomes critical as a unifying, what they call Pan-African global diasporic identity. Now that construction of identity essentially is telling us to ignore the realities of the complexity of the black global experience. The black experience in Germany, the black experience in France, the black experience in Asia, in Russia, in the West Indies, in everywhere. We should ignore, the obvious realities of change, of complexities, and simply assume that the African essence is just permanent, it's immutable, it's unchanged, and therefore, blacks in diaspora are Africans. That's the context. Now, my contention is that, as a historian, this is essentially a historicistic imagination that the historian will challenge. And as a historian, I challenge that in my writings. Now, let me conclude my presentation by sharing with you. Scholars assume the leadership and ideological struggle to authenticate African diaspora black history and culture with crusading zealotry. Blinded by ideology, they saw racial conspiracy in almost every historical lens and responded with an equally conspiratorial worldview. To combine Afrocentric historiography, Afrocentric scholars position blacks on an essentially ahistorical pedestal. It was necessary to revise, to revisit and refight old battles. The most critical of urgent is the epic battle over history and civilization. The quest for legitimacy in history became the driving force of much of Afrocentric history. Civilizations in the Nile Valley and other parts of West Africa became building blocks for establishing legitimacy in antiquity and constructing Afrocentric universal history. In their quest for authenticity in antiquity, Afrocentric scholars made bogus and dubious claims of historical preeminence and universality. In the process, they created a black replica of the racism they opposed. They developed a conspiratorial and Manichaean historicism derived from slavery, racism, and colonialism and their legacies. Although slavery and colonialism ended, Afrocentric scholars argue that blacks in the United States and peoples of African descent globally continue to suffer from destructive legacies of these two. More than ever, they argue, Africans and diaspora blacks remain threatened by the same old enemy. While Africans languish in the cesspool of neocolonialism, blacks in post-slavery and post-Civil War America and globally continue to endure the debilitating impact of legacies of slavery and racism. This reality, Afrocentric scholars argue, mandate African diaspora global unity. They justify this global unity on the basis of shared identity, which they advance as perhaps the key historical force for developing a unified framework of struggle. This monolithic global African identity is premised on the conviction that the essential Africanness of blacks escaped the vicissitude of history. However, solidifying this global Pan-African monolithic identity equally requires homogenizing of the order. The Europeans, the ideological enemy, have to be homogenized in order to fully expose the magnitude and potency of their threat. Thus, to appeal for global black unity, to rationalize conflating and homogenizing the African and diaspora black world and experiences, Afrocentric scholars portray the Europeans as equally homogeneous and monolithic. They attempt to conflate the experience of blacks in the United States, Africa, and globally, entail the historicizing that is de-emphasizing or refusing to acknowledge historical change and transformation. Likewise, the homogenizing of Europe, even in the face of obvious and glaring complexity, is a curious and inexplicable exercise in historical dreaming. Thus, Afrocentric scholars compromise the force that would have established and validated their work. The one which has done not widely recognized would have provided a clear glimpse into the realities of the complex experiences they pursue. Afrocentric scholars defend the prime responsibility, they define the prime responsibility of black scholar or the black historian as essentially ideological, to use historical data and facts to affirm and legitimize and advance the socio-economic, cultural, and political agenda. In other words, they advance subordinating history to ideology. This is obviously contrary to the work of the economy we have today. We are honoring someone whose writings throughout the diaspora, both of Africa and the diaspora, focuses not just on ideology but also on scholarship. Someone whose writings could not be challenged on the grounds of scholarly credibility. This is the issue. This is what academic Isola tell us to ignore. And I think it's only appropriate that that honors Doyin to draw attention to how diaspora historians, a segment of intelligentsia, are actually going against the grain of own scholarship. Thank you.
We have benefited quite a lot from you. Thank you. To give us a word or two, and later Professor Mrs. Bolanle, and then Professor Tunde Bolanle.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished academicians, the special guest of honor for today, Professor Doyin, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as the Yorubas would say, Okamikum, so I will say a few words. I am particularly happy today to meet a lot of people. I think we have to congratulate those who organized this occasion for bringing together the old faces that we have not been seeing regularly. The first person I saw was Chief Akinwumi, and I was surprised. I was delighted. Then I was excited somehow when I saw a name. And when they made the announcement that Professor Mimiko is going to come here, I thought our governor was coming here to address us. So I was looking around for an entourage, and until I saw that it's the look-alike of Mimiko, or the, how do I call it? It's the second Mimiko. I'm happy to meet you formally. That's a good opportunity to be. Now, I think we should praise the efforts of our people who are now preaching the idea of our culture, of bringing up our culture. I think as Professor Akinwumi said, a lot of these things are happening with us, and we are dragging ourselves down several times. Now, there is a farmer's proverb. The farmer was going to the farm, and he saw a tortoise. And then, when he came to it, he picked it up and said, "Oh, I'm lucky today, I've picked a tortoise." And the tortoise said, "Well, you are lucky. If it has been the signs that whoever sees the other first will pick him, I would have picked you." So if we had a literacy, a literature, things like that, we did that right. maybe you have colonized the white people who now colonize us. But that is the advantage of people who first have the opportunity of doing something. But it doesn't mean that our people have not been trying. We realize this, but the white people wanted to make sure that the stories they write about us are true, that we are animals, even in cities. There are several stories about it. When one Prince of Wales came to Nigeria, there was a plane taking him around the cities. I have a story in Oyo. They took the people to a place and then told the people in town that whenever they see the plane going around, they should, they should wave their hands over their heads. So, and they might do that. And what they were trying to say is that the people are animals. Their horns are moving. So they were waving around their heads, look like horns to them. So the white people are convinced that those people are animals, so to say. But it is not always that. Good try that it is important to be literate, to be able to read and write. But we have no characters of our own to write, or to learn, or to do things like that. So what they brought, we learned. There was the story of one of our Obas in Ekiti. The both were going to Ekiti to see the Oba, and the Oba was trying to speak the language of English so that he would welcome the Oyibo. And the first thing that actually surprised him was that when he spoke to the Oyibo was happy in his own little way. And the man was boasting all about, because they shook hands. And he was very happy that the white man shook his hands. And that was another. So these are things that actually affected us. And there was one who actually continued to study the ABC there. And he learned 2 words. He was asking, how do I address the man when he talks? So I said, okay, you know the Nigerian way. You are going to ask for the wife, for the children, for everything. Now you get good. And he continued to study the ABC, which was in book there. And when he came across 2 words, he, she, obìnrin, her, obìnrin, and he was confused. So when the woman came and he began to salute him, how are you? How is your she? Then he remembered, oh, how is your her? He didn't know which one to pick. So it doesn't mean that we are not been trying, but we continue to try. And those of you who can rescue us from this are the scholars. I wish you good luck, and I want to urge you on to continue to do this for us. We need a reorganization, a reorientation of our people. Don't speak to you go to your child and go, say hello to uncle, say hello to so. And if you come, and they sorry, when he does not hit his head against the wall, why are you sorry? Because he coughs. And that is the language they are teaching to our children at home. So we have to be very careful. And we have to work harder. I thank you all. It's a good opportunity. We have many of it.
Bolanle
of this item, and equally distinguished members of the other side of the hall. As the Prof of Faleti has said, I came, and I do apologize that I even came late, but I said I must be here. Whatever is being done for Doyin, I must be present. And I do congratulate the Ibadan Cultural Studies for embarking on this. also for zeroing in on Doyin. Not only because of his work on the panel, but also because of what he has done beyond that in the diaspora. His works speak for themselves, and I can say that I'm proud to be tangentially connected with him and also with his wife. I do congratulate you, Mrs. Adekunle. Tony spent hours and hours in the National Archives. And I used to say, go back home. Your wife is there, she's a young woman and you've just been married. But he said, okay, at the weekend I'll go home. But I used to feel a bit guilty about it, that this man spent so much time in the archives. But we know that the time that he has spent there has not been fruitless. We're happy that a lot has come out of it. Well, the theme for this conference is a good one. And I was happy to have had the opportunity of listening to the two keynote speakers. Some of us, one of the speakers referred to 50 years, and somebody said that's just a short period in one's life. Some of us have seen the 50 years, the beginnings of this country, as it were. And we feel sad and depressed. To us, it's not progress. And ages ago, I used to teach what the students call African jazz. It's African studies, but the students, the rascally students in the University of Lagos used to call it African jazz. And because they didn't like it, because all students had to take that course. And if they don't pass it, they don't get their degree. So I used to try to excite their interest. And I would start with James Brown's song, I'm Black and Proud. And we would start singing I'm Black and Proud, going very jazzy and so on. And I'll let them relax. And after some time, I'll then say, what are you proud of? What are you? You are black. But where is your pride? And I think that song is still relevant to us today. And it's not only just those of us here of the continent, but also in the diaspora. I think our fate is closely bound up. And something has to be done about it. And as it has been said, it's not just in the theatrical forms, but in our concepts and in what we are able to achieve in the international community. I think it is important for us to be able to hold up our heads. It's about time that we can do that. But some of us get so depressed because we are not able to do that. I get particularly depressed when I go to any public gatherings where the elite, the so-called elite, are present, and they put on their clothes, and I look at all the women, and I see these scarves, silk scarves, which come all the way from Korea or whatever. There was a day, bear me witness of this, perhaps. I went to Ademola church. It was a Thanksgiving service. It was a gala occasion. And I decided, well, I try to use my own national key most of the time. And I decided to look at the women, just how many of them had women club. I think there were, out of the population of certainly more than 200, perhaps about 2. The others had these imported items from Korea and all these other places. And I felt sad because it's not just a question of rejecting what we have. It's also a question of making ourselves poor. Those Koreans or whatever have their mills going, their factories are going. They are producing these things in all forms and shapes. They are even faking a woven cloth for us. But what's happening to our factories here? They are dying. So what are we proud of? So I think that this occasion and the conference itself should make us think again, not only our creative expressions, but cultural expressions as well, in all totality. I think the first speaker spoke about production. And these are the things that will make us be able to hold up our heads in the community of nations. They know us for dance, for music and dance. But we have to make people realize that we have much more to contribute. And in that sense, I think it's not just those of us here, but those of them in the diaspora as well. We have a common destiny, and we have to work together. I congratulate the Intercultural group for this effort. I was expecting a larger audience, but don't be discouraged. It's only the beginning. And certainly, Doyin and Mrs. Fashion, don't be discouraged. You have a lot of admirers, a lot of people who respect you for what you have done and what I'm sure you will continue to do. As somebody said, you are not only a historian, you are also a storyteller. I have enjoyed that book. This is only a beginning. I can visualize a period where the Doyin Parallel Conference will become the order of the day that people will want to come and listen to. I've been looking at the program itself, and I already see something which has caught my fancy, the domination of women, Hausa women. So I'm sure the programs, as they build up day in, day out, will bring out interesting basics and facets of our life. I'm glad I'm here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me to be here, even though I came very late. Thank you very much.
Isola. The honoree of today, Professor Bolanle, and his lovely wife, other distinguished guests on the high table, the keynote speakers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me, on behalf of the Center for Black and African Art and Civilization, express my joy and our collective joy at the inauguration of the inaugural Doyin Parallel Conference, and to say that we are fully supportive of this initiative, which we are witnessing today in honor and in celebration of someone that has become an African icon, the doubtable scholar, our teacher, our mentor, our source of inspiration, our role model, a man whose scholarship stands out as one of the best that has come out of Africa, at least in living memory. I am saying this because I've had the privilege of being taught by this great scholar, not just in general studies like Femi Mimiko. I took courses under him, and I'm happy that he has influenced many of us very greatly. And whatever we have turned out to be today is also been partly responsible. I want to thank you, sir, for this good effort. The convener announced earlier that CBAC will play host to the second TOFAC conference, which will hold at the University of Lagos in 2012. I wish to reiterate that. But one thing that makes me not very happy is the fact that the troika of Professor Adekunle, Professor Dasylva, and the anonymous third person, whose name was not disclosed, monopolized the funding of this conference. Some of us were not consulted to chip in our widow's minds. But I believe when you come to Lagos next year, I will retaliate. Karl Marx it was who said that philosophers have interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. And that is my admonition to the participants at this conference today, that at the end of this conference, my personal expectation, and I think the expectation of Nigerians, is that we must have recommendations, positions, suggestions, and ideas that can influence policies directly in order to change our circumstances. Papers have been presented, numerous papers. And what we need at this point in time in our history, in Africa and the African diaspora, are concrete ideas about how we can move beyond the present level that has thrown some of us into despondency and despair. I want to say that neglect of culture, definitely, unarguably, is partly responsible for our underdevelopment. And I think the keynote speakers and Professor Bolanle had actually made that point. But it needs to be underscored that culture not only talks about the people's understanding of the world, their worldview, it also talks about their understanding of the nature of being, their understanding of the nature of relationship, the totality of which gives you an impression of how society is governed, how society moves, and in which direction society is going. And this is why any society that neglects culture is parting ways with development. So we must not get tired of talking about the need for cultural renaissance, for cultural rejuvenation in Africa. Again, because we parted ways with our culture, we have also parted ways with memory. There is something that I think we are missing, and that is that the absence or the loss of memory, especially in our country, has affected the entirety of our society in all its ramifications. What do I mean by that? Memory is not just about what you remember in the brain, it's about continuity, sustainability of policies, of ideas. Governments in the past have done a few things in their communities. I remember in the First Republic, roads were constructed, pipe water was flowing in many villages and cities. But suddenly, since after the military, or since the military came on board up till now, water has ceased flowing. The roads constructed in the 60s have been abandoned, which is a practical demonstration of the absence of memory. Because if there is memory, there will be need to maintain, to sustain, to retain. And this is the essence of culture, which I think this conference must concern itself about. But what do we do? There is the need for us to intensify our advocacy, our investigation into those aspects of our lives, of our culture, that can promote development. And I think one important thing that we have not been doing well is for us to put emphasis on the study of history. Today in Nigeria, tragic history is one of the most undersubscribed discipline in Nigerian universities at the university matriculation examination. You hardly find anybody, any person in secondary school wanting to read history. It's all part of this process of the loss of memory, because it's not business administration, accounting, law, medicine. Whereas those disciplines emerge from history. Now, so we must go back to that, to situations where government is going to ensure that right from primary school, history and culture are taught as distinct disciplines, fields of study, not subsumed under social studies as it is done now. That's part of the problem. If we promote the teaching and learning of history, we are going to recall, we are going to bring back this memory that we have lost so tragically. In the diaspora, let me make this quick one. Brazil, for example, has realized the need for the retention of memory through a recourse to the teaching and learning of history and culture. And in 2003, the former president of Brazil, Lula Dasylva, caused a law to be promulgated in Parliament, which is called Decree 10,639 of 2003, which makes it compulsory for African history and culture to be taught at all levels of the Brazilian educational system, at a time when we are moving away from the teaching and learning of history and culture. What an error. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I think the other issue that we must influence at the level of policy is the issue of a recourse back to our indigenous languages. Our languages, our culture contain things that could help us develop technologically, develop economically, as Professor Bolanle has pointed out, develop also politically in terms of our governance systems, and also develop philosophically. I mean, you need to listen to Professors Akinwumi, Isola, and Professor Ademola, Faleti. Baba, you are looking at me, you are a professor. And I say that with all sense of responsibility. Mr. Chairman, once again, I want to thank the Intercultural Studies Group for putting this up. It's a very commendable effort. We identify with you. We identify with the man in whose honor this has been instituted. And we pray that he lives to be 100 years so that we can continuously reap from his fountain of knowledge. Thank you very much.
Professor Adeleke, also on sabbatical at the Department of English University of Uganda. Our own Professor O.C. Additional at the Department of History, University of Uganda. Aisha Bawa from Fanafo University, Sokoto. Dr. Ikwasi, immediate pass into the theater, University of Uganda. And Dr. Adekunle Ajasin. Thank you. Let me hand over to the chairman.
TOFAC Excellent Leadership Awards. In the same spirit with what people have been talking about the development of some standards in people. Whatever you are doing, you have to do it well. And when you find excellence, you reward it. And if you also find people who misbehave, who are deviant, you punish them. So today we have TOFAC Excellent Leadership Awards for 3 people. The first of all is Doyin himself. Before we give him the award, Dr. Ope will read Doyin citation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am reading a citation on Professor Doyin. Let me warn that the last time I read the citation, and it was much smaller than this, I had to call the MC and the chairman to assist me because I was running out of oxygen. In case I run out of oxygen today, I'll call on the convener of the conference, Professor Dasylva, who gave me this assignment not quite 2 hours ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to be very brief because we have spent so much time. I have a document now of about 60 pages, but I'll read it in 10 minutes. I will just go through. Professor Doyin is born in Ibadan. Several years ago, I hear Ibadan is the largest city in West Africa. Professor Fowler began his career at the famous University of Ife, where in 1976 he bagged his BA Hons, and 5 years later he earned his PhD. Because of his love for scholarship and because of the amount of academic production that he has engaged himself in, some 8 years later, the University Faculty of Arts recommended him for full chair at the University of Ife. Even before he was recommended, it was very clear the direction of his scholarship. When therefore he crossed over in 1989 to the Diaspora, he had begun to show increasingly that he was determined to be relevant to his own world. Professor Falola has won several teaching awards. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very bad with numbers, but I tried to count very conscientiously, and I was able to isolate 26 teaching and lifetime awards. I'll mention some of them. He won the 2010 Outstanding Graduate Teaching Award of the University of Texas. In 2004, he was awarded the Academy of Distinguished Teachers Award. He also got in 2001 Texas Excellence Teaching Award. By 2002, he had one of the most prestigious awards that a single university can give. That is the Jim Holloway Award for Teaching Excellence. When you move on, he also has won the Distinguished Africana Award 2011, Career Research Excellence Award 2010, this was given to you by the University of Texas or something. Africana Studies Distinguished Global Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award, given to him by the Indiana University, Purdue, Indianapolis. He has won also the Distinguished Africanist Award by the African New World Program at Florida, and several others. I told you I was just going to mention a few of them. Professor Falola has distinguished himself in every way. And because of his academic achievements, his friends and some of those he taught decided to package several volumes in his awards and with several volumes on his personality. Currently he has, and this is a feat that nobody can say he has replicated. He has about 4 fish scripts in his honor. I'll mention this. The first was edited by Professor Ademola, and it is titled The Transformation of Nigeria. edited by Ogundira, edited by Akin Ogundira on pre-colonial Nigeria, published in 2005. Then the latest one is the one edited by me at Folabi, Toyin Falola, The Man, the Myth, and the Mask. This was published in 2010. Professor Falola has held several positions in his distinguished career. Currently, he is the Francis Hogginbotham Nile Centennial Professor in History, Department of History, University of Texas at Austin. He has held previous academic positions, some of which include the Professor of African History, the University of Texas at Austin. This was in 1991. Between 1990 and 1991, he was Professor at York University, Ontario, Canada. Between July to December 1989, he was Senior Lecturer and Senior Research Fellow and Project Coordinator, Oral Documentation, Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, Lagos. Between 1988 and 1989, he was Smoot Professor and Smoot Fellow, the University of Cambridge in England. Between 1977 and 1990, he held several positions at the University of Ife, rising through the rank from a graduate assistant right up through to 1988, when he was recommended for full chair at the department in University of Ife. Professor Falola's scholarship has won several fellowships and honors. I have listed about 7 here, and I won't want to bother you with them. I'll move on to more serious issues. His publications. This is where there is the greatest challenge of counting numbers. I will just mention them briefly, because Falola's scholarship is not only in history, it cuts across all disciplines that knowledge has been fragmented into. But very briefly, Professor Falola has about 130 books. I warned you earlier that I may not be correct, because I remember in 2010, we were in Austin celebrating his 100th book that he has published. And while we were there, it was announced that 4 or 5 were already out. So the numbers keep increasing. For books, he has 430. For chapters in books, he has 153. For journal articles, he has 52. For encyclopedia entries, he has 15. And for book reviews, he has 101. Where are the mathematicians? If you put that together, you realize that we are talking here of between 450, 500 publications to his credit. But all this would not have been possible if Falola, like they say, does not have a close-knit family. Professor Falola is married to the amiable Olabisi Florence Falola, who we call Mommy. And the family is blessed with 3 children, Isola, Dulapo, and then Doyin. Permit me, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you this scholar who has made a very phenomenal mark in the field of African, not just history, but African studies and African American studies. Professor Falola is being recognized today for this honor because of his wonderful contribution, not just to scholarship, but also to the production of human beings. He is a great institution builder, a man that is respected globally, and a man that is very humble. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Falola.
Stops working, and we have to thank his wife herself, an ex-student of Ife, who made a first in computer science. Yeah, in computer science. So academics runs in the family. And I remember one time I was in the US and my father asked me to come and spend some time with him. And I spent a whole week in his own house. And my room was next to the study. And I noticed that every time I wake up to do something, I would see light and I would go there and he would be there working. And the small hours of the day. And one time I went and said, look, this is too much. Relax, go and sleep. He would laugh. Say he has so much to do that most of the time you cannot afford to sleep. Now we are seeing the results of hard work. The next person who will receive an award, Excellent Leadership Award, is Professor Tunde Babawale. So please stand up, and I'm calling on Mr. Adekunle.
Thank you, the chairman. Before I start, I saw an episode outside at the beginning of this conference, and I saw something similar to it right here. When Papa Faleti came, I saw Professor Bolanle meeting him, and I was shocked. I don't know, when he prostrated and I said, so old people greet old people. But I think that is the issue of the Moluabi concept here. People nowadays shake the hand of their capacity. My job has been made very easy because the long profile of Professor Babawale has been reduced to 2 pages. And I'm going to do that very easily and quickly. That does not undermine the fact that he's a very achieved and accomplished person. Professor Gabriel Olatunde Babawale is a professor of political economy in the Department of Political Science, University of Lagos, and also the Director General, Center for Black and African Art and Civilization, CIVAC. A distinguished academic whose intellectual prowess and traverses Nigeria, Africa, and the world. He was born on the 4th of October 1961 at the Inishan, in Osun State, southwest Nigeria. Professor Olatunde Babawale has his post-primary education at Initial Grammar School, Initial, Osun State, from 1973 to 1977. As an undergraduate student at the then University of Ife, now of Aguoru University, from 1971 to 1985, he had his university education at the first level. He then he distinguished himself as a versatile academic, having to his credit 2 prestigious academic honors. First, he was scholar, University of Ife, between 1983 and 1984, and departmental scholarship awardee for best graduate overall performance of the Department of International Relations in 1983 to 1984 session. His 27 years career, which he has dedicated to teaching, research, and scholarship, started during his National Youth Service years between 1981 and 1982, when he served as a teacher at the government secondary school, Noma, Ademola State. He was subsequently appointed as an assistant lecturer at the Adeleke College of Education affiliated to Ademola University in 1985, where he made significant contribution to the development of the department and more so to the development of the university in general. In 1991, Professor Tunde was appointed lecturer grade 1 by the University of Lagos, where he got to the peak of his academic career with his appointment as Professor of Political Economy in 2002. Professor Tunde was the founding and until recently managing editor of the reputable Unilag Journal of Politics. He was voted the best lecturer in the Department of Political Science, University of Lagos, by the students in a university-conducted survey for the 2003-2004 academic session. Professor Bolanle is a member of many learned and academic associations and societies, some of which are Nigerian Political Science Association, NPSA, Historical Society of Nigeria, and the Third World Forum, Nigeria Network. After 24 years of distinguished scholarship, Professor Tunde was invited in August 2006 by the federal government of Nigeria to serve the nation as Director, Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Black and African Art and Civilization of the Federal Ministry of Tourism, Culture and National Orientation. Less than 4 years after his appointment, Professor Tunde has transformed the 30-year-old center into a world-class art, international appeal, and global recording. I'm very sure what I'm saying very a lot of things unspoken. As a scholar and researcher, Professor Tunde has not only trained scores of students who are now achievers in their respective field of endeavors, but has also attracted valuable institutional patronage and enormous goodwill to the University of Lagos through its department. In spite of the enormity of his present assignment, he still attends to academic and administrative issues within and outside his primary constituency, the University of Lagos. Professor Tunde is a distinguished administrator and exemplary scholar. His books and articles published in reputable scholarly journals are very topical and of contemporary significance. His numerous publications, totaling more than 60, include books and monographs. His two-volume book titled Nigeria in the Crisis of Governance and Development, published in 2006, is considered a laudable X-ray of Nigerian politics, governance, and administration. His analysis of issues of contemporary significance in his book, Urban Violence, Ethnic Militias, and Challenge of Democratic Consolidation in Nigeria, brought to the fore the complexity and social reality of the management of diversity in contemporary Nigeria. Professor Bolanle has, to his credit, not less than 14 authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited books. Professor Tunde is an eminent personality and potential intellectual. He combined a rare academic capability with administrative and organizational wizardry. This is evident. Thank you. More are coming. This is evident in the many esteemed and sensitive administrative positions among several other academic trusteeships that he has been trusted with over the years. He has made success of many of these numerous outings, most outstanding of which include being Secretary of the Academic Staff Union of University, ASU, University of Lagos Chapter, between 1993 and 1996. Assistant Dean of Student Affairs, University of Lagos, between 1998 and 2000. Member, University Panel of Inquiry on Court Activities, the University of Lagos, in 1994. Chairman, Ford Foundation Grant Committee, Department of Political Science, University of Lagos, between 2002 and 2005. Chairman, Examination Results Verification Committee, Department of Political Science, University of Lagos between 2001 and 2006. Chairman, Intellectual Nodal Contact Committee, University of Lagos between 2005 and 2006. A committee set up by the Vice-Chancellor to oversee the implementation of the University Strategic Plan. He was also Secretary, Faculty Communication Committee, Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Lagos, between the year 1997 and 1999, among other responsibilities. His impressive list of awards and honors include Dr. African Leadership Award in 2008 in recognition of excellence performance. Distinguished Leadership Role Model Award 2006 for outstanding leadership qualities and inspiration to younger generation by NAS, National Association of Nigerian Students. And the United States Department of State Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs Award for participating in International Visitors Leadership Program on Cultural Heritage Preservation in 2008. All these attest to his pedigree as an outstanding scholar of no mean achievement. This is confirmed by his responsibilities as the principal organizer, chief host, and coordinator of 5 international conferences for experts on students and scholars of Africa and the African Diaspora Studies, Trinidad and Tobago, 2006, Republic of Benin, 2007, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 2008, Brasilia, Brazil, 2009, and Abuja, Nigeria, 2010. Through these efforts, University of Lagos has received quite a number of research grants and institutional support from credible international organizations and donor agencies. Its analytical skill and objective approach to issues stand him out as a constantly sought after personality by the media, especially on issues of importance to contemporary governance, Black and African people. And I'm very sure we have had a taste of that in his response to the presentation this afternoon. His significant contribution to a series of efforts at rewriting history of Black and African people and striving to ensure appropriate placement of Black and Africa in the global discourse is legendary. Professor Tunde is married to Mrs. Adekunle, and the couple is blessed with children. This is a brief version of what I had as a follow on Professor Akinwumi today.
Professor Bolanle, I do congratulate you on this award and for your very many distinctions. I have great pleasure presenting on behalf of the Cultural Studies. Well, I do congratulate you on the presentation of this award by the Cultural Studies. And congratulate you for that excellent speech the speaker and for your activities in your university. Congratulations.
For your patience this morning. We have a few announcements. Now our tea break has been dovetailed to lunch as well. So there is tea break outside and also entertainment. There are drummers, musicians and so on outside. And shortly after that we are going to have our lunch at Bedo Dome. There is a bus waiting outside to convey us to Bedo Dome.